Very excited to have Andreina Alexatos here for our Wild Neighbors speaker series. She's an arborist with the TreeFolks organization, and she'll be talking to us about the benefits of planting native trees and some tips on how to do that. I'm Johanna Arendt with Travis County Natural Resources, and this speaker series is a collaboration between Travis County and the City of Austin Water Wildland Conservation Division, which actually co-manages the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve with Travis County and a number of other private and public partners. So before we get started with our main feature today, I just want to mention that we will be having a live Q&A after the presentation with our speaker, which will be facilitated by Jaya Torres with City of Austin. And so if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the bottom of the screen or wherever it shows up on your screen in the Q&A section. So we're actually trying to not put them in the chat and in the Q&A section instead. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Andreina. Looks like you're muted, Andreina.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andreina Alexatos. As Johanna mentioned, I'm an arborist for TreeFolks. I have been working for the organization for, it was going to be 6 years in October, but I put in my resignation at the end of July so that I can be with my daughter and kind of take care of things with her for a little while. It was time to move on anyway. I feel like my assistant was doing such a good job that she deserved a raise. And so, but I am working on them on a consulting basis. So that's why I still have my email address, at least till the end of the year. And I'm going to be working on some things related to carbon and research. But I'm no longer the reforestation director as I was. Let's see, let's get started. All right, and I'll be talking to you all today about tree planting and selection, particularly in Central Texas. Oh, the button's not working. Here we go. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to go to the next. The buttons didn't work. All right. First thing is, right, what is a tree? We'll start at the very, very basic. A tree looks like this typically when it's allowed to grow to this full extent. So unlike maybe some other common knowledge, these are not trees, right? Trees don't have their roots be an upside down reflection, and nor are they palms, right? Palms are technically a grass, but they do grow very tall and sturdy, and so arborists often deal with palms. And by arborist, I mean anyone that has taken the certification from the International Society of Arboriculture gets a certified arborist, in a sense, license to go and do certain kinds of tree work or consulting. Basically, it keeps people up to date on current standards. And so it makes sure that you have someone that is true to the knowledge of trees. So roots actually grow about 1 to 2 feet. About 90% of the roots will be in the top foot or two of soil. And basically a tree, unlike a grass, is a what do you call it? Like a perennial. It's a permanent fixture. Grasses, they grow, they die back, they grow again, they die back, they spread, etc. Trees will grow up and out. So as they are gaining height, they're also gaining girth. And thus, we have those two growth patterns. Not pattern seasons that trees go through. So one of them is a little lighter than the other. So that's why we have the tree rings on them. And of course, it has everything that you're familiar with: leaves, stems, and roots. And a forest, simply put, is it's the grouping of trees. I think anywhere there's probably two or more trees, you could consider technically a forest. We have here our map of where different forests lie, and you see the cool coniferous in the dark green up top. Those are going to be your pines and firs and spruces, things that can tolerate cold weather. Underneath, you'll see a temperate mixed forest where you're going to see more oaks and things that are, deciduous, and you will find some conifers as well. The warm, temperate, moist are interesting. That's Florida for us here in the United States. And basically it's not it's almost tropical, but there's a few freezes that kind of keep it from being tropical. So then you go down, you have your tropical, and then your red is your dry forest. So you can see Central Texas, we are in a temperate mixed dry forest. So we get a little bit of everything here, as you could tell by the recent snowpocalypse, right? We do get enough snow to not be a tropical place, but we're also not a cool coniferous forest by any means. And we happen to live in an urban forest. You know, there are trees in the city, and thus by definition, it's an urban forest. Urbanization, however, creates certain issues that that come with the territory, right? When you have a lot of trees, you have a lot of evapotranspiration, very little runoff. Water actually seeps in and goes in the water, and then you get groundwater infiltration. Whereas when we replace those things with concrete, we have very little evapotranspiration. Well, evapotranspiration is reduced, but we have a lot more runoff to deal with. Here is kind of a diagram saying the exact same thing, right? As there's less ground cover that is green to absorb the energy, then you have this urban heat island effect where the cities are almost always much hotter than their rural counterparts, and trees have a lot to do with that. So a healthy tree is going to have some lush green leaves. The roots are going to have enough air and water to get through and grow and do their cation exchanges with the bacteria and the fungi, and it's all good. Whereas an unhealthy soil, although it might actually have the nutrients the tree needs, if it's compacted, too dry, it's going to lack that cation chemistry with the roots. And so the nutrients might be there, but the tree's ability to intake them will not be. So there's a tricky part there, because desert soils actually are full of nutrients. They just lack that chemistry because there's no water or fungal networks. So when it rains, it pours, right? We are in flash flood alley, and we get the same amount of rain that Oregon, Portland does, but we get it in 2 weekends instead of over the whole year, right? So when it rains, the water has nowhere to go because we have put concrete everywhere. So of course it either floods or it goes through these gigantic tubes. So trees could serve as infrastructure in a way. We see sidewalks and buildings and streets as infrastructure, but a lot of times we don't count trees as being part of the infrastructure. I mean, they're not forever, just like a sidewalk isn't forever, right? So if we treat them like they are part of the infrastructure and we give them, you know, the very little they're asking for some air, some water, and some growing medium, I feel like we can have a nice balance of the heat urban island effect. And so why trees, right? This is tree selection. We live in an urban forest, so we can't just pick a mango tree and put it in our backyard and expect it's going to grow and give fruit, right? So the pros outweigh the cons, in my opinions. I know trees can be a hazard, they can be expensive, they can cause allergies, maintenance is an issue. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why not trees, but in my opinion, the pros definitely outweigh the cons. And if you select the right tree, put it in the right place with the right maintenance, you shouldn't have a lot of issues. So I'm going to kind of go through these quick because it can get very detailed. So if you have any specific questions, make sure to include it in the Q&A. But the right tree in the right place is the most important part. You want to think about several different things, which I have numbered here, functions being one of them. What do you want out of the tree? Do you want it because it's pretty color? Does it give you shade? Does it attract hummingbirds? Does it give you fruit? All right, you want to think about maybe what you want to get out of that tree, not just maybe one thing. And you want to consider the space you have available. Trees do grow, and if you don't plan your landscape design for the right size, the correct sizing of the tree, at least the potential size, then you can get into some trouble as far as hazards and just space. Another thing to consider with selection, of course, is soil. You don't necessarily have to go all out and do a soil test, but those soil tests do help let you know what maybe your soil may be lacking of or very abundant in, so that you don't overdo it with the nutrients. Typically, you don't need to add nutrients unless you have found a reason to do it. But there are different soil types, and different trees thrive in different types of soils. So you want to make sure, for example, you don't bring a loblolly pine from Bastrop and plant it in the Austin alkaline soil here. You know, while it might live for maybe the first 30 years, once it gets a certain size, it's just not going to like the soil, no matter how much acidity you try to put into it. So soil is important. And that test they're doing with the water is a percolation test. You essentially dig a cubic foot of soil, fill it up with water, and see how long it takes for it to percolate. If it's there more than a day, it's not very good percolation, and you have some compaction issues or a lot of clay. Other things to consider: climate and rainfall. I already talked about how Texas is kind of a weird mix. We have a little bit of everything. And so thinking about those microsite conditions right now, we didn't used to have to think of things that could survive a freeze, but now we have to think of things that can survive both extremes, the freezes and the heats and the wildfires and everything. Other factors are human activity based, are people going to be using the space, compacting the soil? Are they going to whack at it like they did here? Who knows, kids sometimes mess with trees. And so think about what kind of human activity. The worst human activity is probably just the compaction, the stepping on a place for so long that it compacts the soil. So think about, what kind of activities are going to happen around the tree you want to plant. And your maintenance commitment, right? If you really want that maple to grow here, you're probably going to have to work a little harder at it than if you were to plant an oak that, is already kind of used to the soil and will grow pretty quickly. Here's some species selection resources. Obviously, visiting local arboretums and gardens and nurseries is your first step. Talk to them about what you want to do, what you have space for, what you're looking for. Of course, the TreeFolks website has some resources as well. The Texas Forest Service interactive tree selection tool, that's what you see here on the side. They have all kinds of things to consider when planting a tree, and they have very good illustrations about planting and maintenance, selection. You can even type, I need a tree that is small, that is pretty with the leaves, that can stand drought, and they'll give you some recommendations of trees. And I would try to pick some of the trees that maybe are a little bit more less known, less popular, that are maybe your native trees, native Texas trees that do really well that nobody knows about. Wildflower Center is always a good information. You want to know more about that plant, that's my go-to. Certain plant. Procurement, you can definitely get bare root trees or trees that are in a ball with their soil like that. With bare root trees, you want to make sure that roots don't dry out, but it is possible. As long as the tree has all its roots, you don't need to plant the soil with it. So some folks think, oh, my tree's dead, the roots are exposed. No, if they haven't dried out, it's still good enough. And one thing to consider when getting container trees, so I'll back up and say, if you're going to buy a tree, a sapling or a 1 gallon, maybe a 5 gallon at most is a good size, because even though you're getting a big tree that's a little sapling, it's going to grow so much faster than if you get a really gigantic tree and have to baby it for years before it even adapts to the soil, right? And the little one will have outgrown it by then. So things to consider when getting container trees are these girdling roots here. You can see it at the top. I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing with my mouse, but you can see the girdling root at the top here. So when you go to the nursery, make sure you check, you kind of remove the soil from the neck, the base of the tree, to make sure it's not buried too much, that the roots aren't girdling like this, because basically if you take that tree and you plant it here in our clay soils, you just took a potted tree and planted it inside another pot, a clay pot in the soil. So the roots are still going to grow in a circle, not out and strong like the first picture we saw. And the tree will eventually choke itself out or fall off its whole. And this is the last slide, I think. So for planting, Some things to remember, right? You want a high quality tree. That means, you know, a tree that looks healthy, that the leaves are not all defoliated, that there's no broken limbs and girdling roots. You want to call your utilities. Make sure you're not going to bury a tree where there's underground utilities. With that said, pay attention to the utilities on the top too, the power lines and everything. You can plant under power lines as long as the tree is small when it's fully grown. And so then the width, the depth, you want the width to be wider than the depth. The depth should only be about as wide as the root ball or root system of the tree is. And maybe you plant it a little bit above the root flares so that while the tree sinks in over time, it's not going to end up with the soil up here above the root flare. And we dig them wider. We don't just make a hole and put the tree in. That way this soil that you took out is actually you backfill it with the same soil, so the bacteria and the nutrients are all there still, but now they've been aerated, and when you water it in, it's going to start that fungi magic. You can add compost. It doesn't hurt in these soils to add some compost. The 3-inch of mulch is the rule of thumb. You want your mulch to be about a thumb's length away from the root flare of the tree. You don't want it piled up on the tree bark at all. And about 3 feet depth, like about a foot, a thumb's depth, excuse me, of mulch. If you stack it any higher than that, it's not gonna get wet enough to do the fungal network that I talked about. And if it's too little, then it'll scorch and not serve the coverage function you want out of it. And of course, heavily water your tree in when you prune it. I mean, when you plant it, the first water is the most important. If you don't water the tree ever again because it's a desert tree or whatever, that's fine. But as soon as you plant it, you have to water it so that it can get established. And avoiding stakes or ties, because these things make a brittle tree by making it too firm, right? When a tree sways, it's a strong tree. Now, if it's plopped on the ground or something, you can stake it temporarily until it shows signs that it's growing towards the sun. You don't want a flopped tree to start growing towards the sun all misshapen, but for the most part, you shouldn't have to stake or tie a tree. And if you do so, only for about a year or so, because any longer than that might also start choking the tree out. You can protect trees from browsers by adding cages around them, or root. They have these root flare guards that you can put. I highly recommend these, especially if you're planting a smaller sapling, because squirrels will just come and chomp at them because they just need something to chomp at. So when they're about a finger's girth, that's when they're perfect. So definitely protect your trees. You never know. And plant in the winter. You don't want to plant when it's super hot. I know that's probably when you're thinking about wanting to plant the most. But technically you can plant a tree any time of the year. Don't tell other arborists I said this. But you have to remember that there are certain consequences and responsibilities associated with when you plant the tree. So in the winter, you're going to have the least amount of work. You put the tree in, it's going to be dormant, probably not have leaves if it's deciduous. You plant it, you water it, and it's going to start investing energy in the roots almost immediately. Whereas if you plant it in the summertime, it has all its leaves, it's putting energy into the leaves and the roots. So when you plant it, probably the first thing that'll happen is all the leaves will start to fall off, right? And that doesn't mean it's dead. That's why there's a caveat there, right? It doesn't mean it's dead. You have to keep watering it, testing the branches. It might have a little bit of dieback. It doesn't mean the whole thing is dead. The whole thing might die, but it might come back from the root, right? There's all these things that could happen because the tree is now freaking out in a sense. So planting in the winter is the best way to make sure the roots are established before spring comes, and now I can put all that energy into the leaves. I could talk trees for days, so please let me know if I went too fast or too slow, or if you have any questions. I'm not sure how I did on time either.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ina. Let's see. It looks like there might be a couple of questions in the Q&A, which Jaya will be working on. I wanted to just ask a follow-up question. There was a little bit confusion about the ligustrum. Could you talk a little bit more about why that's not recommended and why we would be looking for alternatives to ligustrum?
Yes, thank you. So ligustrum is a landscape preferred tree because of what I mentioned. It grows fast, it's typically drought tolerant, it's evergreen, so it creates a privacy fence as well as shade year round. But the problem is because it's so good. Sorry, 3-year-old walking in. Because it grows so good and so quickly, it also starts to take over the natural landscape. So now we see it all over our rivers and our creeks, and it's so good at growing that it's overpowering the native landscape. So because the shade is so dense that it creates, you think it'd be a good thing. Oh yeah, more shade is better, right? But it's a monoculture of shade, and that's not healthy. So biodiversity is key. You don't want any one thing, native or not, to be honest, to be overtaking a certain area, a certain region. And so our fight with the ligustrum is that it's not native, it overpowers the natives, and for some reason it's still widely available in nurseries. So I don't know why there's a huge disconnect there with what's offered in the nurseries versus what we know shouldn't be planting. So like Andreina, right, another bush-like one that people like to plant. So anyway, I digress. Planting native is also a better idea because when a snowstorm happens or something that, you know, Texas is used to, your tree is probably going to make it. I saw a ligustrum, well, a lot of them came back, but there was a really big one at a place near here that didn't make it. It was just not the right conditions for that tree. And anyway, so we want to replace it with trees that also grow fast, might be evergreen, but are also native to where they're not going to disrupt the natural landscape and allow the biodiversity, right? So with that, I'll say, you know, oaks are great, but they are the #1 tree planted when a new subdivision or anything comes through. So I always encourage folks to find something other than an oak so that you can start adding a little bit of diversity in the mix.
Awesome. You talk a little bit more about why that biodiversity is important and what it means to local wildlife to have those species that they've evolved with?
Absolutely. No, biodiversity is the #1 thing. I should have probably had a whole slide just on biodiversity, not just for the sake of the wildlife, right? But the trees themselves, they need diversity, because when something does happen and come, you know, a disease, right? Like the Dutch elm disease that came and essentially eradicated the elms. A lot of issues came from that, right? Wildlife didn't have a home and a source of refuge anymore. You know, people didn't have shade, either the land didn't have shade or the stormwater mitigation. And so we saw in Bastrop when the fire burnt, right? Because it's almost a monoculture of the pines, even though they evolved with fire. You know, people move in and take away the biodiversity in a sense that may have naturally happened. They, you know, don't maintain the brush, right? And so when a fire happened, it took everything out, and only the strong came back, right? Like the Yopon holly, unfortunately native, and the loblolly pine. But a lot of the specialty trees people may have planted, they probably died too. But biodiversity is important for all kinds of birds, because when there's birds that are attached to a certain tree, we all know, you know, the golden cheek warbler depends on the juniper to survive. And so if it's probably never going to happen that the juniper will all be gone, but the old growth junipers might be, and those are the ones they need, right? And so we could lose biodiversity in an exponential way, even by losing just one tree species. The exponential loss of the insect and bird and just the wildlife, wildflowers, diversity, everything kind of goes with it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ina. We're coming up right on 1 o'clock. And so just to respect everybody's time, we're going to end it here. But there's lots more questions that folks have. It's great to see everybody interested in planting trees, because we know they do so much good. It's just, as you said, really important to find the right tree for the right spot. So thank you again so much for joining us and for giving us so much information.